We begin in Afghanistan, where fighting between Afghan government forces and the Taliban is intensifying. Afghanistan's defense ministry has claimed that at least 175 Taliban fighters were killed and 84 others injured in airstrikes in the last 24 hours. Afghanistan's armed forces carried out those airstrikes in 14 provinces across the country, including the provinces of Logar, Ghazni, Kandahar, Herat and Balkh. A large number of weapons, ammunition and equipment were also destroyed in those airstrikes. Meanwhile, the US has said it will continue airstrikes in support of Afghan forces fighting the Taliban, even after the August the 31st deadline which the country has set for the withdrawal of US forces. But a top US general in Kabul acknowledged that there were tough days ahead for the Afghan government.
The United States has increased airstrikes in the support of Afghan forces over the last several days, and we're prepared to continue this heightened level of support in the coming weeks if the Taliban continue their attacks. We continue to provide contract maintenance and logistics support here in Kabul to maintain Afghan defense capabilities, including their aviation capabilities.
With US and Western troops in the final stages of withdrawing from the country, violence and fighting has only increased. This after the Taliban launched a sweeping assault, capturing numerous districts, border crossings and encircling several provincial capitals. Afghanistan's government has called on human rights agencies and the International Criminal Court to investigate allegations of war crimes by the group. Meanwhile, the alleged organizer of a rocket attack on the presidential palace during Eid was arrested with 3 others in Kabul. The arrests were made during an Afghan special forces operation in the city. The Taliban is yet to comment on the arrests, and no group had claimed responsibility for the attack. In the region of Kandahar, more than 22,000 Afghan families have been forced to flee from their homes in the past month as fighting escalates in the area. Local authorities have set up camps for the displaced, who are estimated to number more than 150,000. Kandahar, with its 650,000 inhabitants, is the second largest city in Afghanistan after Kabul. The southern province was the epicenter of the Taliban's regime when they ruled Afghanistan between 1996 and 2001. With the Taliban making territorial gains, civilian casualties are also on the rise. In its latest report, the United Nations has warned of unprecedented civilian deaths due to the Taliban offensive. The report says that more women and children have been killed and wounded in Afghanistan in the first half of 2021 than in the first 6 months of any year since 2009.
Despite multiple attempts at peace talks, armed conflict between the Afghan forces and the Taliban have only been escalating. The current conflict in Afghanistan is in its 20th year, and bearing the brunt of this war are the innocent Afghan civilians. A latest United Nations report says more women and children have been killed and wounded in Afghanistan in the first half of 2021 than in the first 6 months of any year since 2009. The report added that Afghanistan saw a 47% increase in the number of all civilians killed and wounded in violence across the country in the first 6 months of 2021, compared to the same period last year.
For the first 6 months of 2021, women and children made up nearly half of the total number of civilian casualties, which is obviously a huge concern. They were particularly affected by ground engagements, at times when they were sheltering in their homes. Many of them were impacted by mortars, artillery and also airstrikes, and also they were affected by IEDs.
The report blamed anti-government forces for 64% of civilian casualties, with 39% by Taliban, 9% by Islamic State group and 16% remain undetermined. The report claims that Afghan security forces were responsible for 23% civilian casualties, pro-government armed groups for 2%.
The most egregious attack taking place on the 8th of May, the school near the school in Kabul, where over 300 civilians became casualties of 3 IEDs, many of whom were schoolgirls who were leaving to go home that day.
Afghan National Security Force spokesman General Omar Shinwari rejected the report on the civilian casualties that blamed Afghan forces for 32% of civilian deaths. He said that security forces have retreated from many areas to prevent civilian deaths. The report found a particularly sharp increase in killings and injuries of civilians since May 2021, when the American and the NATO troops began to withdraw. Taliban offensives since then have only been mounting, with the terror group taking over more than half of Afghanistan's districts. It also claims control of over 90% of Afghanistan's border posts, a claim which the Afghan government has outrightly dismissed. Taliban has insisted that Afghanistan will not witness any peace until there is a new negotiated government in Kabul and President Ashraf Ghani is removed. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Moving on to some other news now, and Beijing has blamed the United States for a stalemate in a tense start to high-stakes talks taking place in the Chinese city of Xinjiang. US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman met with Chinese Vice Foreign Affairs Minister Xi Feng. According to Washington, the US envoy was very forceful, raising a range of issues during the meeting, including Beijing's crackdown in Hong Kong, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Tibet, curtailing of media freedom, Beijing's alleged cyber hacking, and the South China Sea. According to the US, Sherman also accused China of being unwilling to cooperate with the WHO on a probe into the origins of COVID-19 and affirmed cooperation in areas of global interest like climate change. Meanwhile, Chinese state media claims that Beijing handed Sherman a list of demands. According to the Chinese state news agency Xinhua, Chinese diplomats presented Sherman with 2 lists of demands. One was about, and I quote here, wrongdoings that the US must stop. And the other was individual issues China is concerned about. For example, Beijing has asked the US to remove visa restrictions on Chinese students and Communist Party members.
China has faced problems when it comes to issues concerning US and China's relations and has frankly clarified our position and stance on the development of said relations. We expressed clear opposition to the interference by the US in China's internal affairs, which harmed China's interests, and we have made a clear request for the US to change course and correct their mistakes. At the same time, both sides had an in-depth exchange of views on a wide range of topics which are of mutual concern.
America's number 2 diplomat is also meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Sherman is the highest-ranking US official to visit China since US President Joe Biden took office 6 months ago. Her visit also comes at a time when US-China relations are at an all-time low. Bilateral ties between the two countries have soured to an extent that foreign policy experts don't expect any significant takeaways from this meeting. The talks come just 3 months after icy talks in Alaska between the two countries. But if these talks are successful, they could help set the stage for an eventual summit between Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping, which is expected to take place on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Italy in October of this year. The Biden administration has sought to rally partners around the world against what it says is an increasingly aggressive China. Washington has criticized Beijing for its treatment of Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region. Earlier this month, the US Senate actually passed legislation banning the import of products from that region.
All of the COVID support, what we're doing is how to pay for these programs. Good job.
Moving on to the United Kingdom now, where the government's COVID alert app has been stirring up quite a controversy. Last week we told you about the NHS, that's the National Health Service app, that prompts people to self-isolate if they've come into contact with an infected person. The scheme applied to pretty much everybody, but had exceptions for key workers. That includes people working in the border forces, police, supermarkets and transport, to name just a few. Among people employed in these areas, those who received the alert would get tested at designated sites and resume work if they tested negative. Now, trade union leaders in the UK are up in arms against the government's decision to let essential workers ignore a possible infection alert. Top unions have encouraged people to stay at home and isolate, ignoring these special conditions. This was first reported by The Telegraph. Talking to the newspaper, Steve Headley, a top official at the RMT union, said that why should our people be infected with COVID-19? He claimed that the government is panicking and forcing workers to come to work when it's not safe. Headley has also threatened to launch a strike against UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's administration's exceptions scheme. The NHS app was launched last week as the UK eased almost all of its COVID-19 restrictions, but it's also caused widespread disruption. Airports in the UK saw a minimum 3-hour waiting time as a significant portion of the border force staff were under isolation. Next week, vaccinated expats will also start arriving in the UK. And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's cabinet will meet today to discuss what's being called a pingdemic as the summer travel season begins in the UK. Our London bureau chief, Mandy Clark, has the latest.
Senior ministers are looking to extend daily COVID testing sites to allow more exemptions from isolation for critical workers who have been hit by the so-called pingdemic. Now, the COVID committee is discussing if the testing regime should be widened out to help more work sectors. However, the hospitality industry is the one that has been hit the hardest, is not expected to be covered in the discussions. Now, new case numbers of COVID reported each day in the UK has fallen for a 5th day in a row, but it's still early to tell if the data shows the impact of ending England's remaining legal restrictions on July 19th. Mandy Clark, World is One, WION, London.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced that the country's third wave of coronavirus has largely passed its peak. The average number of daily new infections has been at around 12,000 over the past week, which is a 20% drop from the previous week. Following that decline, COVID restrictions have been eased in South Africa, including a ban on liquor sales. The continent's worst virus-hit country had gone back into a partial lockdown last month to stem a resurgence of the virus widely attributed to the Delta variant. The country has now been moved to COVID alert level 3.
The latest figures suggest that we have largely passed the peak of the third wave of infections, although there are areas in the country where we still need to be concerned. After receiving all these recommendations, decided that the country should be moved from adjusted alert level 4 and be placed on adjusted alert level 3. This will take effect later this evening once the regulations have been gazetted. This means it takes place with immediate effect.
Now, alert level 3 means that the country can start to reopen again. You can travel between different provinces, for example, and non-essential restaurants, like establishments like restaurants, can also reopen. But a nighttime curfew remains in place and face masks are still mandatory. Ramaphosa has warned that people should continue to make all efforts to contain the spread of the virus, also noting that plans to start manufacturing vaccines in Africa and for Africa were gathering pace. South Africa has recorded more than 2.3 million coronavirus cases, with nearly 70,000 deaths. Its vaccination program has been sluggish and hit by several setbacks. Just over 2.3 million people have been fully vaccinated since February. WION's correspondent Kalden Ongmu gets us the latest from South Africa.
South Africa has eased lockdown restrictions to alert level 3, citing lower COVID-19 infections. President Cyril Ramaphosa said that the latest figures suggested that the country has largely passed the third wave of COVID-19 infections. Under alert level 3, the sale of alcohol for off-site and on-site consumption will now be permitted. Gatherings can take place with 50 people indoor and 100 people outdoor. Interprovincial travel for leisure is also permitted, but nationwide curfew will remain in place from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m. The president has, however, cautioned that while COVID-19 infections in Gauteng province were declining, infection in the Western Cape, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal were still rising. According to the Department of Health, as of July 25th, the cumulative number of COVID-19 cases identified in the country is around 2.37 million, with 9,718 new cases. The number of deaths as of July 25th stands at 287, bringing the total deaths to 69,775. This is Kalden Ongmu from Johannesburg, South Africa. For WION, World is One.
The 14th edition of the Traversée de Paris has kicked off in France. The event saw 700 vintage, antique and classic cars parade past some of the city's most iconic monuments, such as the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe. Take a look.
Now, this may seem like an unusually heavy traffic day in Paris. Only it's a lot more special than that. Paris hosted its 14th edition of the Crossing of the Paris event on the 25th of July.
Very good surprise. Very good surprise. I would like for the Traversée de Paris to take place every Sunday, because right now they are coming and going. There are cars everywhere. You don't know where to look at. Really, I would like for it to take place more often. I don't know if it is every year or every 6 months, but it should be more often. Maybe even every week or every month.
An event that saw 700 vintage cars cruise through the streets of Paris, making pit stops at the iconic Parisian monuments, such as the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe or Montmartre's Sacré-Cœur Basilica. The convoy took off from the Vincennes Castle, ending the trip at the Meudon Observatory, with vehicles registered through the Vincennes en Ancien. This event presented an opportunity for automobile enthusiasts to learn more about the automobile and cultural history.
It is extraordinary because the automobile industrial heritage and the Parisian architectural heritage, which is obviously absolutely fabulous, echo each other. We're driving through all of Paris's most beautiful squares. We just passed through St. George Square at the bottom of Pigalle. It's a magnificent square with an ancient metro. It really is a very beautiful and little known place. That is what is fun actually.
With distancing measures, face masks and negative PCR test reports, people part of the Traversée de Paris gathered at various locations. Who would want to miss such photo ops after all? There you have it, the Citroën 2CV driving past, the Moulin Rouge Cabaret facade. The event drew motorbikes, cars, buses and tractors from all over France and even other European countries such as the Netherlands.
I think it's wonderful. I think the camaraderie is wonderful. And I also think it's wonderful for people just passing by like me to be able to sort of feel a part of it and sort of be drawn to different cars for different reasons. For example, there's a car over here, I think an old Chevrolet, that my father and mother got married in a very similar car back in the 50s. So I was drawn to that one and sort of found it really fascinating.
Bureau Report, WION World is One.
And that's all we've got time for on today's WION Live broadcast from Washington, D.C. We'll leave you with these visuals from the 38th annual New Jersey Lottery Festival of Ballooning, where crowds watched as more than 100 colourful hot air balloons filled the sky. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned to WION for more global news and updates.